It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexis Ross, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategy and Acquisition Reform. Prior to her current position, Dr. Ross served in several different capacities on the House Armed Services Committee, most recently helping then Chairman Mac Thornberry develop reforms to recent NDAA relating to government procurement and access to intellectual property. As the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategy and Acquisition Reform, Dr. Ross has spearheaded several reforms to not only change the Army's acquisition strategy, but its mentality and culture regarding intellectual property. In December, then Secretary of the Army and now Secretary of Defense Mark Esper issued a memo directing procurement offices to adopt these reforms. As a press release from the Army noted, Dr. Ross's reforms seek to address the inconsistent way in which the Army has historically dealt with intellectual property, noting that we either demand more data and rights than required when it's costly and can drive away companies, or we wait until late in the acquisition process to negotiate intellectual property rights, which may lock us into long-term costly sole source arrangements with original equipment manufacturers. Key to these reforms is getting the Army to engage with industry at earlier stages of acquisitions to discuss the life cycle maintenance and intellectual property needs of the Army as it operates weapon systems for decades into the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ross.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the introduction. Also for the invitation to be here. I love coming out and talking about IP, especially in unusual circumstances. I haven't been asked to talk about IP as it relates to TransDigm and other monopoly practices, but I do see the connection, and we can talk a little bit about that. So I think this is a great opportunity. I'm glad that you're all getting together and taking the opportunity to talk through monopoly pricing and predatory practices. It's an important thing to keep on top of, and so these kinds of forums are really helpful to the debate. So obviously this issue has gotten a lot of press lately, the DOD IG report and a lot of congressional activity on the matter, but it's not the first time that the department has dealt with these things. And so some have suggested that the root, or one of the causes of this problem, in part at least, is that the government doesn't have access to intellectual property. And it's true that in the past the DOD has really struggled with how it negotiates IP and how it communicates with vendors and how it manages and approaches that practice. So I'd like to spend my time today talking with you about how the new Army's approach to intellectual property might address some of that. So the introduction was very good. It really encapsulated a lot of the principles behind the Army's new approach. And so what I'll do is I'll go through this in some level of detail so that you can see what I mean by all of this. But in essence, the Army's approach is to require more robust planning up front. And that, in essence, protects our options later. So it ensures that we don't find ourselves in an unfavorable position down the road. So what I'll do is I'll highlight some of the ongoing change, what brought about the new policy. I'll describe the policy and its 4 principles. So you'll see it's sprinkled throughout here, a different kind of business acumen that we're trying to apply to the IP management, and which might be helpful to you today as you discuss this topic. And then I'll make sure that I end by talking about how we're implementing it, because a policy is just a policy without an implementation plan, and this is a change in the way we approach, so that's a cultural change, and that takes some time and some deliberate effort. So let's get started. The reason that Secretary Esper and Dr. Jetty, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, sought to forge this path and create a new approach to IP. It was the result of a lot of shifts in strategic direction in the IP policy debate recently. So and I think it's important when talking about this to understand how that changing approach to IP affected DOD leaders in Congress. Because we've been at this for some time. There's been a few years of this shift and transition. You'll see that there's been a transition in perspective that's underway right now, where we've moved from seeking rights to as much of the data as possible to seeking the rights that are required for the program. And so taking a more strategic view. Historically, the Army's approach has been somewhat tactical rather than strategic, fairly uncoordinated and somewhat inconsistent to how each program office would manage intellectual property. And it bred a situation where over the years, this pendulum's always swinging in policy, right? And over the years, you'd have either one of two default approaches. We found that either the Army would attempt to seek as much IP as possible, really more IP than what is required, which is costly. You have to not only attempt to obtain the license, but then you have to pay to keep it up. And some of this stuff is software code. It's not easy. It just can't remain stagnant, right? So it can be costly, but it also, we find, drives away industry. And as the defense market, you probably talked about this a little bit today, as the defense industrial base has shrunk over the last few decades and there are fewer players involved in it, we don't want to be in a situation where we're driving away industry and they're not willing to partner with us. So on one side, we would often demand more IP than what was required. And on the other side, sometimes in the other end of the spectrum, we would refrain from obtaining or negotiating any IP at all up front. And we would say, well, we'll deal with that in the sustainment phase of the life cycle. All that does is push off these critically important negotiations until later on, when you're already in business with one company, one vendor, and then you've locked yourself into a long-term, costly arrangement with an original equipment manufacturer, an OEM. And so then you're in a sole source situation, and you're beholden to a single company. So the ends of these two spectrums is where we often found ourselves. But the shift that's been happening recently with DOD leaders and with Congress is to adjust and to try to find a more reasonable and responsible way to handle IP. We saw this a little bit we saw this very much so in the FY17 and the FY18 National Defense Authorization Acts. So Congress sought to change the law in two key ways. So first, it addressed the allocation of rights and tried to provide and direct the proper balance between the legitimate interests of government and the legitimate interests of business. And it also, and it's important here to understand that it is a balance, because on the industry side, intellectual property is the lifeblood of the company. It allows them to remain competitive over the course of several decades. It's their revenue stream. But on the other side, for the government, it's extremely important to us that we have access to technical data and computer software, because we maintain weapon systems for decades, much longer than many people would expect or would be surprised to learn. So we have to make sure that we're able to sustain and then eventually upgrade or modernize those systems over the course of several decades. So the law sought to swing the pendulum right back into the center and try to find a mutually agreeable arrangement in the rights allocation between both parties. Also, the second law that came out in the FY18 timeframe sought to alter DOD's approach to IP. So as I talked about a minute ago, historically, DOD's had either this black or white perception of how to do this. They either found themselves obtaining too little or obtaining too much, attempting to obtain too little or too much. And this wanting all or nothing kind of situation is really it's not prudent, really. The answer lies somewhere in between. And so no two programs are the same, and the law initiates some changes that accommodate this nuance. So shifting over here to the DOD, we can see this shift in mentality and approach evident in the way that DOD senior leaders are starting to approach IP as well. So I think they're recognizing that we need to be savvier customers, and they're trying to make us smarter users of IP. And so it also supports a very large initiative that is going on in the Army right now, modernization. So we're very interested in making sure that we have access to all the great innovative technology and capabilities that are available in the private sector. Sometimes that's with non-traditional companies and small companies. And this is exactly what the Army Futures Command was set up to do. It's a new 4-star command located down in Austin, Texas, and it's one of the things that they're charged with doing is trying to move us forward into a more modernized capability set and to achieve technological overmatch. And so in order to do that, you have to have a good, healthy relationship with industry to be able to leverage what they're working on in the private sector. So let's talk a little bit about what is in the Army policy and how this shift is represented in our new mentality and our new approach to IP. So So the Army recognizes that IP is an important, critical part to weapon systems. It's going to be increasingly important as software and other technical data becomes a larger part of the system. In some ways, a weapon system is more about the software than it is about the hardware, becoming more so. So in December of 2018, Secretary Esper established the Army Directive on managing intellectual property. And it really does reflect a new approach. So I'm going to walk through the 4 principles that this offers to the Army community. The first is to plan upfront and create tailored IP strategies for a weapon system as it's being developed. So no acquisition the same, no 2 acquisitions the same. In fact, there is, and because of that, IP should not be treated the same. So when you're embarking on a new acquisition program, you have to understand that this is a complex system. It has multitude of components, and in fact, perhaps each one of these pieces or parts would have its own type of IP and data requirements. So we have to be thinking through the different sustainment and modernization needs across the life cycle for all of these components and pieces. We need to be thinking and looking at this piece of equipment and saying, understanding the unique characteristics of not only that equipment and how it operates, but also its subparts and components. We need to consider that in terms of what the commercial market affords, what our organic industrial base can do for sustainment, meaning the depots and the arsenals. We need to understand what our upgrade plans are, whether or not this system, for example, is a system that employs modular open systems architecture where you can plug and play different pieces like black boxes, and consider that and what that would mean for what technical data and computer software that you need, and therefore what you need to have access to. So after you go through this upfront planning, and you develop your customized IP strategy, then, and again, doing this upfront planning, I can't stress that enough, it makes us savvier customers, it makes us understand the future so that we are in charge of our own destiny, so that we leave ourselves options if we've planned ahead. It gives us more, it really protects our interests down the road. The second principle is you take that customized, tailored IP strategy, and then you go in and you negotiate with industry for a customized IP license. So the approach that I mentioned before of negotiating for GPR, government purpose rights, or better, broad, extensive, far-reaching rights to a large amount of technical data is easier, but it's not savvier. So that's no longer going to be the default approach. We're seeking to negotiate for the appropriate, not all, the technical data. So that is what we need to sustain the systems or to upgrade them. Now, this means implementing creative and flexible approaches and license arrangements with industry. So we don't want to overpay, nor do we want to stifle innovation. So that's a key part too, right, is making sure that we are being met halfway with industry. So this is a big step forward for the Army, agreeing and understanding that it's, like I said, it's sometimes easier just to say, why don't you give it all to us, and then we'll start. That's a good starting position, but that's not always the smartest approach for handling the negotiation. So this is a big step forward. It's really kind of a step to the middle ground here, and of course, we would expect industry to take a step forward into the middle ground with us. So if we have a very reasonable request for a targeted amount of technical data and the rights to use it, we would expect that industry would come forward with a reasonable response of a price and willingness to negotiate the license for that. So that gets to the third principle, is how do you negotiate with industry to do this? So a key part of that, and this is where the principle focuses on, negotiating early enough in the process so you can get competitive prices. This is your basic economic principle of not waiting until you have no competition and only one, sole source provider. Trying to negotiate it early enough so that you can set the prices so that you're taking advantage of that economic principle to get a more competitive price. We are stewards of the taxpayer dollars. We have to be thinking about this. So that is a critical piece in this IP policy. The fourth principle, which really underpins them all, is fostering open communication with industry and safeguarding IP. So open communication is going to be critical to this. Much of this is based on negotiating for custom licenses. That means that we need to do a better job in the Army of communicating to industry with what our technical data needs are and our rights intentions are early. It's very hard to have a good negotiation and a sound business relationship if the two parties aren't upfront with each other at the beginning. So being on the same page is really the best way to come up with a mutually beneficial license arrangement, and that's what we're after. So moving ahead to implementation, as I said, this policy, it offers a framework for the acquisition workforce to approach and manage IP, but it does need to be bolstered by a number of different activities that we can do to help everyone understand how to deal with this very complex, nuanced landscape. IP is not easy. It's highly regulatory, it's highly legal, it's a very complicated set of rules that govern it, and it's very technical, in terms of what we're talking about, a certain computer software code, a certain blueprint drawing. So it's complex, and the best thing to do is to take a multi-step or multifaceted approach to moving the culture. That starts with the policy as the first piece of communication. It continues, and that was the one that the Secretary Esper signed in December. It continued with the release of the implementation guidance. And this one, the Assistant Secretary, Dr. Bruce Jetty, signed. That implementation guidance is a much longer, more descriptive, explanatory guide on how to actually execute this policy in the field. So it starts with, what is IP? It's got a background chapter at the beginning. It's got templates at the end for non-disclosure agreements, things like that. And so that's the second step of communicating to the field what we mean. The third thing to do is creating a temporary team of, like a tiger team, of people that work on IP all the time. It's their day jobs. These are people from across the legal community, the contracting community, the logisticians, the program management offices, people that work on IP as their day job across the Army. So that means across the country. Bring them together in a matrix capacity where they can help us write the implementation guidance that we spoke of to make sure that it was really usable to the field, and so they can help us communicate to the program offices and the contracting offices on what we intended with the policy, how to implement it, how to apply it to existing programs. And that's important because that's kind of like a chain teaching sort of mentality where we're communicating with them at headquarters and then they're communicating in the field with the people that they work with all the time. And since these are our IP experts, they are able to reach out and touch the contracting officers and the program managers that are doing this on a day-to-day basis. The next thing is this team came together to help us on Pathfinder programs. So the best way to do something that you don't really know how to do is to watch somebody else do it first. So we found 4 programs that we could use as Pathfinder programs, not pilot programs, but actual tests in the real world, use the policy in real time so we could observe it as it happens. The point is to, 1, serve as models for future subsequent programs. 2 is to gather lessons learned and take those back and incorporate them into that implementation guidance I talked about so that we're continuing to keep that thing updated. We'd like to update it about every year or 2. Now, how do you find the best programs, right? You want a representative set of about 4 programs so that a few programs so that you can best understand, if they're going to be models, you want them to best understand and represent various different types of things that the Army buys. The Army buys a lot of stuff. And it's big things like attack helicopters, and it's small things like combat boots. So our IP rights and our IP needs are different in these different circumstances. So it's helpful to show everyone a variety of examples. So we looked at a number of qualities when we picked these programs. Qualities like the size of the program, I just mentioned that. So that means the dollar level, how big of a program this is. We also looked at the schedule. A lot of what I talked about discussed planning early, negotiating early, so you can start to see the trend early. Early is the trend. And so we needed to make sure that these programs were early enough in their life cycle that this implementation team, this little tiger team, could get together with that program office and that contracting officer and help shape the program before it got too far down its trajectory. We also wanted to look at commerciality. That's an important thing for IP. IP law and who has what rights is based on who paid for what. So commerciality means, when I say that, I mean, to what extent is this new product something that was developed exclusively for us, or was it something available on the commercial market? You can see, depending on who paid for it, whether it was the company that paid to send it into the commercial market, or if it was us that paid to have it developed for our use, the IP rights would be different. So we needed a blend of those kinds of things so that we were making sure we could show examples of how to handle both situations. And of course, we wanted at least one software-intensive program. As I mentioned, as these programs become more and more heavily reliant on software, it's going to be a very important factor in how we handle intellectual property. And since the non-traditional pathways are becoming the norm now, and when I say non-traditional pathways, I mean not your average DOD 5000, but the new middle tier acquisition authority and things that use other transaction authorities, other transaction agreements, OTAs. And also for the Army, cross-functional teams. We have interdisciplinary teams that come together and bring the right expertise together to try to stimulate and move the ball forward quicker on acquisition and priority acquisition programs. So we wanted to make sure we had a couple of those Pathfinder programs that could accommodate those kinds of features as well. So the 4 programs that we settled on, and we're always assessing to see if more are needed, is the Next Generation Squad Weapon, which is a replacement for the rifle, the Precision Guidance Kit, anti-jam, which is it's a technology to improve the accuracy of projectiles and then to enhance the anti-jam capabilities. Third, the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft. So that's the Black Hawk replacement, if you're not following that, FLRAA. And finally, the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, IVAS. It's like augmented reality goggles for soldiers. And that one's interesting. It's a little bit farther along in its life cycle, but it was such a unique case, we really wanted to take a look at it. Microsoft is the prime on that one, and so it's a non-traditional vendor. It's a middle-tier acquisition program. It means it's moving quickly, and it has another transaction agreement, so that means it's not a FAR-based contract, but a different kind of agreement. So that one's great for gathering lessons learned, being so software-intensive and everything as well. So between the implementation guidance, the implementation team, the Tiger team that comes together with expertise that can help the program offices and fill out the training manuals, between the Pathfinder programs that test the policy in real time and provide examples for the future programs, and to that, we're also doing training and education. We're working with Defense Acquisition University to help develop and shape a new IP curriculum. We've filmed a video that they'll be using with students, so that kind of thing. Those training and education and constant road shows to help between the Assistant Secretary, Dr. Jetty, and myself, trying to communicate to the field on what's intended by the policy, what do we mean, how to do this, how to work through some of the stickier issues. All of that is important because this is truly a change in mentality as it is a change in approach, right? So it has to be handled like culture change. Culture change requires clear, consistent communication from the leadership and time. And so over the time, it's not going to happen overnight. Over time, we're hopeful that we'll see some real change in the way we handle intellectual property. So, in closing, while I don't personally work on monopoly pricing or predatory practices that you're talking about extensively today, I'm confident that based on what I've observed, both inside the department and through Capitol Hill and forums like this, that the conversation continues to evolve, and we are going to be making progress on it. There's been a lot of great discussion today. I heard that during the break. And then for the Army, I think that one thing we're doing to at least better position ourselves on these matters is to improve the way we approach IP. And as I said, the old practice of either demanding broad IP and extensive rights to use it, or failing to negotiate for any IP at all, that is not a good practice. It's not going to set us up for success. And so we're really trying to get after that by altering the way we approach the issue and the way we approach industry. So thank you again for the invitation and for letting me share at least my small piece of this. And I think we've saved a little bit of time for a couple questions, hopefully. Great, yes.
Speaking of the Army's customized IP program, which sounds great, by the way, is there a plan to have a shared platform across the other branches of services, DOD, Homeland? Maybe not. I know that part numbers are different and all of those things, but is there the thought that there could be a shared procurement platform where all of this data would end up and procurement officers from different branches of the service, DOD, Homeland, could go in and track some of the things that we've been talking about today?
So I think when you say shared platform, I think you don't mean weapon system, and I think you don't mean
I'm sorry,
acquisition system.
I'm speaking
Okay.
I'm speaking in terms of from my world, not yours. So a shared database.
Okay.
Of
For storing tactical data.
historical
Yeah.
information, pricing information, cost
Sure.
information, all of those things that several people said today they need.
So I think that one of the things we need to get better at is storing our contracts and the licenses that go with those. I think that in the past, I'm a little outside of my complete expertise here, but I think that in the past we might not have filed these in a way that made it easily accessible. And contracts and storing contracts is one thing, but also the licenses, an associated thing is the licenses to the technical data. So we may have negotiated for rights to a piece of a widget, right? And a right to use the technical data related to that widget. Now, in the 1970s, we may have negotiated this. So where is that contract? Where is the appendix that has a license to prove that we actually negotiated for but for what? So I think we have a lot of work to do to clean up how we store and manage the licenses. So I can't speak really to cost and pricing data. I think probably some work needs to be done there too, but I think that when it comes to licenses of technical data that are worked out during contract negotiations and are part of that contract file, I think we have some work to do to improve how we store and access that so that it is available across the Army over time.
Yes. Well, and also, what you paid for the IP, what is a fair price for the IP?
Exactly.
That's what was good. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks again for being here, Dr. Ross. You mentioned starting early is the key to this, and you also mentioned the Army's future long-range assault aircraft. I'm wondering, is it too late already to capture some of the IP involved in future vertical lift, since that's something that's already under demo right now? And if it is, what can you do about it to avoid the F-35 sustainment problem that we're seeing?
So there's two variants, remember, the CAPESAT 1 and CAPESAT 3. So the Pathfinder program we're using is FLRAA, the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft. So we think that it's still early enough that we can work on that and get the work with the team. So the implementation team, they go out and they talk to the program office and the contracting officer, and they help shape what they're attempting to, help them shape actually their planning, the sustainment that they plan, and their life cycle considerations, and then help them understand how to, what to seek. So I think that recall that these are going to be, they're several years off.
Right.
So, anyone else? Okay.
Sorry, just to clarify, FLRAA is which capability
I don't want to, I don't want to be incorrect, because I think that, I can't remember if it's 1 or 3.
But I guess-
I'm not gonna, I'm sure that someone can get that information for you,
Sure.
so.
But it just sounds like you have sort of, you can address one of those, but it's early enough to address one of those, but not the other at this point.
I don't think that's not, I think that there's still time to work through intellectual property. And if we, so what we have to, so this is what we have to be careful of, right? We have to stop thinking about things as, oh, it's too late, so let's not try. You know, we have to get into the mentality of always attempting to engage with industry as early as you can, but certainly not waiting until we're in sustainment. We certainly don't want to be in a situation where we wait until we need to do maintenance and then we go out and try to get the technical data. So I think that it's never too late to make those attempts.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. We spoke a lot earlier today about monopolies and companies that would be charging excessive profits to the military. Could you speak to the extent that excessive profits inform the IP reforms, if at all, and how you think, looking forward, the IP reforms that you just outlined could impact that?
So what shaped this policy was a number of things, which I walked you through. It's been a tension point for some time between government and industry for several years, probably decades. And it's been something that has, as I said, it's been on the minds of leaders in Congress for some time. And when this set of DOD leadership came in, it's something that they came in wanting to explore and attempting to improve. So, you know, Dr. Esper being someone who is a very intelligent policy person, but also having the experience of being in industry and understanding business acumen. Undersecretary McCarthy, same thing. Dr. Jetty, the ASALT, same thing. I mean, Dr. Jetty is an interesting person as well because he's a small business owner, or was a small business owner, an inventor, and a patent holder. So in terms of a person who could come in knowing and understanding the ins and outs of both sides of the argument, you couldn't think of a better person for that. And of course, recall, all of this happened after he retired from the military and was working in acquisition while he was here. So he really could see both sides of it. So this is a long time coming, and it's something that's been, I think the greater policy community that's been working on IP has been working toward for some time. So the stage is set for a great change, and I think that the Army is really well positioned and on its way to making that change.